There's a photograph from 1967 that still makes people stop and stare. A young man stands on stage in Montreal, arms raised in victory, and his physique looks less like flesh and more like something carved from dark marble by an artist who'd never heard the word impossible. The judges didn't know whether to crown him or disqualify him for looking too perfect. His name was Sergio Oliva, and the body that made grown men question reality, it came from workouts so brutal, so different from anything the golden era had seen, that even today, most people wouldn't last 20 minutes following his routine. But here's what almost nobody knows. Those training methods weren't born in some state-of-the-art American gym. They were forged in Cuban sugar fields, refined on beaches with rusty barbells, and perfected in a Chicago basement after 12-hour shifts in a steel foundry. This is a story of how a boy who cut cane at dawn became the man bodybuilding couldn't quite control. You need to understand something about Sergio. Before we go any further, this wasn't a kid who grew up dreaming of trophies and magazine covers. On July 4th, 1941, he was born into poverty so deep that having enough to eat felt like victory. His family was enormous, more than 20 siblings in some accounts, and when you're one voice among that many, you learn early that survival means work. By age 12, Sergio was swinging a machete in the sugarcane fields alongside his father. Picture that for a moment. The Cuban sun burning your neck before breakfast. The sticky sweetness of cut cane mixing with your own sweat. Hands blistered raw by noon, but the rows stretching on forever. That wasn't training. That was life. But every swing built his back a little thicker. Every hour under that weight built endurance most men never touch. His body was learning lessons that no gym in America could teach. The cane fields were unforgiving. There was no clock to watch, no whistle to signal breaks. You worked until the quota was met or until darkness made it impossible to see. Sergio's hands would crack and bleed, then callous over, then crack again. His shoulders burned from a repetitive motion of lifting and swinging. His legs learned to stay stable on uneven ground while his upper body did the work. This was the foundation nobody talks about. Before Olympic lifts, before Chicago, before any of it, a boy's body being shaped by necessity in a place where weakness meant hunger, and hunger in a family that large wasn't abstract. It was dinner missed. It was watching siblings go without. So Sergio kept swinging, kept building, kept becoming something harder than the work that was supposed to break him. At 16, his father made a decision that changed everything. He told Sergio to enlist in Fulgencio Batista's army. There was no birth certificate, no documentation proving the boy even existed. The recruiting officer just took his father's word. And just like that, a kid from the fields became a soldier. Military life gave him structure, discipline, the taste of official strength. He wore a uniform that stretched tight across shoulders that kept growing. He learned to march, to fight, to follow orders. But then the revolution came. Castro swept through Cuba like a storm, and suddenly the rules changed. Batista's army dissolved. Men who'd worn a uniform with pride now melted into the streets, hoping nobody remembered which side they'd been on. Sergio found himself back in Havana, a young man with nowhere to go in a body that had grown powerful from years of labor nobody had been watching. He started spending time on the beaches, and that's where he saw them. Men lifting weights in sand, crude barbells loaded with mismatched plates, the ocean breeze mixing with their grunts of effort. The equipment was primitive, rusted iron that left orange stains on your palm, bars that bent under heavy loads, plates that didn't match, so you had to calculate the weight yourself. But the men lifting didn't care about aesthetics. They cared about strength, raw, practical, the kind you could feel in your bones. A coach noticed Sergio standing there one afternoon, noticed the width of his shoulders, the thickness already showing his frame. Despite his youth, he walked over and asked if Sergio had ever lifted before. The answer was no. The coach handed him a bar anyway. Within months, Sergio was training as an Olympic weightlifter. Within a year, he could clean and jerk over 400 pounds. The foundation was set. Those beach sessions, barefoot in the sand with waves crashing behind him, taught him something crucial. His body responded to weight differently than other men's bodies. It grew faster, adapted quicker, hungered for more. By 1962, Sergio had risen high enough to join Cuba's national weightlifting team. They were traveling to the Central American and Caribbean Games in Kingston, Jamaica. For most athletes, this was the pinnacle. For Sergio, it was an escape route. Security was tight. Castro's handlers watched these athletes like hawks because they knew what wealth and freedom looked like beyond Cuba's shores, and they knew what desperate men might do when given a chance. Sergio stood in a stadium tunnel one afternoon, his heart hammering in his chest in a way no barbell had ever managed. He was calculating, not reps, not sets, but something infinitely heavier. If he ran and failed, he'd never see daylight as a free man again. Prison, interrogation, maybe worse. If he succeeded, he might never see his family again. His mother, his father, those 20-something siblings scattered across a country he'd have to leave behind forever. Most men would freeze under that math. Sergio ran. He sprinted toward American officials and screamed for asylum in broken English mixed with Spanish. His teammates watched, frozen, tried to decide if they had the same courage. Security moved to intercept him, but he was already across that invisible line where Cuban authority ended and international protection began. And in that single moment, everything changed. His legs, built from sugarcane fields and beach squats, carried him into a new life. Within weeks, dozens of other Cubans followed. Athletes, security staff, anyone who'd been watching and waiting for courage to show them the way. Sergio landed in Miami first, working as a TV repairman while barely speaking English. The work was honest but small, fixing television sets for families who had no idea that the quiet Cuban in their living room had just risked his life for the chance to stand there. Friends told him Chicago had better work, better opportunity, a Cuban community that could help him find his footing. So he went north, carrying nothing but the body he'd built and a hunger that exile only made sharper. Chicago in the early 60s wasn't kind to immigrants with accents and no connections. Sergio found work in a steel foundry. 10 to 12-hour shifts in brutal heat, shoveling and lifting metal in conditions that would break most men by lunchtime. The noise alone could shatter your nerves. Clanging, grinding, the roar of furnaces that never stopped. Sparks flew in arcs across the darkness. The air tasted like metal and burned your lungs if you breathed too deep. Men worked with faces covered in soot, hands wrapped in gloves that still left burns when you grabbed something the wrong way. This was America's promise for a Cuban defector with no credentials, hard labor that paid enough to survive. And Sergio took it without complaint. Because compared to what he'd left behind, this was freedom. The freedom to work yourself half to death and still choose where you went afterward. Most men stumbled home afterward and collapsed. Sergio went to the gym, not some modern facility with mirrors and motivational posters. The Duncan YMCA. A basement gym with low ceilings, wooden lockers that smelled like decades of sweat, and plates so old the numbers had worn smooth. The air was thick with chalk dust. The lights were dim, water-stained ceiling tiles, concrete floors that collected puddles when it rained. The sound of the city above, buses, sirens, footsteps, bleeding through the walls. And that's where the myth began. Because what Sergio did in that basement, after 12 hours of manual labor, made no sense to anyone watching. He wasn't following programs from magazines, wasn't doing 3 sets of 10 and calling it a day. He was following something else, something instinctive and almost frightening in its intensity. Here's what people who trained with him remember. He'd start with warm-ups that looked pathetic. The empty barbell on squats would shake in his hands like he'd never touched weight before. His knees would tremble. His back would round slightly. Bench press with 135 looked like it might crush him. Training partners would exchange glances, wondering if the big Cuban was having an off day. Maybe the factory work was finally catching up. Maybe he was sick. Then the working sets would begin. And everything changed. By his 3rd set, the bar was moving faster. By his 5th set, he'd added another plate. By his 10th set of squats, he'd have 500 pounds on his back, repping it out like he was annoyed it wasn't heavier. On bench press, after that shaky warm-up with 135, he'd load 315 and knock out 20 reps, then drop to 225 and do 50. 50 reps with 225 pounds. In one set, men would stop their own workouts to watch. Not because it looked easy, because it looked impossible. But here's the secret nobody understood at first. Those weren't straight sets. Sergio used something he'd figured out on his own, something coaches today call rest pause, but he just called survival. He'd rep to near failure, rest 5 seconds while taking huge breaths, then rep again. The bar never left his hand, never went back on the rack, just stayed in that zone where muscle meets will. Another pause, another few breaths, more reps. The weight would drop an inch, then come back up, drop again, come back up. His face would contort, sweat would pour, and the count would keep climbing. Time under tension that would make modern trainers weep. Pumps that made his skin look ready to split. And he did this for everything. 15 to 20 sets per exercise. Not 5 exercises per body part, maybe 3. But those 3 got brutalized with volume that seemed impossible. High reps, too. 15 to 25 reps per set, even on chest and arms. Rarely dipping below 15 unless he was doing legs. And even then he'd finish in the teens. He believed high reps built quality muscle he could maintain while dieting. The science didn't matter to him. The mirror did. And the mirror showed something that shouldn't exist. Arms that looked bigger than his head from certain angles. A chest that pushed forward like armor plating. Shoulders so round and full they created shadows on his torso. And that waist, impossibly small, like someone had taken a normal man and pinched him in the middle. The X-frame that would become his signature. But here's where it gets stranger. Sergio rarely used full range of motion on upper body work. On preacher curls, he'd stay in the bottom third, keeping constant tension on the lower bicep. The bar would move maybe 6 inches, up and down, while his forearms trembled and veins snaked across his biceps like highway maps. On concentration curls, just the top half, emphasizing the peak, he'd sit on a bench, elbow brace against his inner thigh, and curl that dumbbell to the shortest range imaginable. But the peak of his bicep would swell anyway, pushing up like a clenched fist under the skin. Bench press? Partial reps, short and fast, never locking out where the tension disappeared. The bar would move in this tight space between his chest and 3/4 extension. Constant speed, constant tension. His pecs would burn like someone was holding a torch to them. His training partners would ask why. Why not full range? Why not touch the chest and lock out like everyone else? He'd shrug and say something simple in that thick accent that never quite softened. Why go where the muscle rests? Stay where it works. Constant motion, constant tension. The weight never stopped moving until the muscle had nothing left, and he almost never trained to absolute failure. He'd stop with a few reps in the tank. You could see in his face there was more there, maybe 2 more reps, maybe 3, but he'd rack the weight and step back. Forced reps? He hated them. Hated having someone pull the bar up for him. Hated the feeling of going past where his muscles could take him alone. The magic came from volume, from pump, from chasing that feeling of his muscles swelling larger by the minute. And that pump was real. People who watch him train describe it like watching someone inflate in real time. He'd walk into the gym looking big, already impressive, already thicker than most men at their best. 30 minutes later, he looked impossibly big. An hour in, and grown men would stop their own workouts just to stare. His arms would swell until the skin pulled tight and shiny. You could see the separation between muscle heads, the striations appearing as the pump peaked. His chest would push against his t-shirt like it might burst through. The fabric would stretch. The neckline would get tighter, and veins would appear that hadn't been there at the start. Not little veins. Ropes, cables running down his arms, across his delts, snaking over his chest. This wasn't normal muscle growth. This was something else. Something his body had learned in those Cuban fields, on those beaches, in that foundry. A work capacity built from a life that demanded it. And now, pointed at iron with religious focus, it created physique that photographs couldn't quite capture, because seeing Sergio in person felt different than seeing his picture. Photographs flattened him, made him look big but explainable. In person, the three-dimensionality hit you. The way his lats flared out so wide they created this V-shape that seemed aerodynamically impossible. The way his arms hung away from his body even when relaxed because there was too much muscle to lie flat. The way he'd turn sideways and you'd see the thickness, chest pushing forward, back sweeping out behind him, creating this profile that looked carved rather than grown. He started winning everything in sight. Mr. Chicago in '63. Mr. Illinois in '64, rising through the amateur ranks so fast that by the time he turned pro, everyone knew his name, but they weren't ready for his body. At the Duncan YMCA, he'd met a serious bodybuilder named Bob Guida, a man who became Mr. America in 1966. They trained together, pushed each other, existed in that rare space where rivalry and friendship blur into something productive. Guida was technical, methodical, a student of the body. Sergio was instinctive, relentless, a force of nature. They'd trade sets and trade theories, neither fully understanding the other, but both benefiting from the contrast. But in that same year, 1966, Guida beat Sergio for the AAU Mr. America title, and anyone with eyes could see something was wrong. Sergio stood on stage looking like a comic book character made flesh, and the judges gave the trophy to someone else. It was the first hint. The first whisper of what would become a pattern. Sergio's physique, wasn't just better. It was different, alien, and that made people uncomfortable. Because if you let this man win, what does the sport become? What does the standard become? A standard nobody else can reach. A standard that makes every other champion look incomplete. The judges could feel it even if they couldn't articulate it. This Cuban defector with broken English and a body from another dimension was a problem. Not because he wasn't the best, because he was too much the best. And too much in bodybuilding has always been political. In 1967, Sergio Oliva won his first Mr. Olympia, and bodybuilding changed. Not because the sport wanted it to, because it had no choice. His victory pose, that front double biceps with arms so huge they dwarf his head, became legendary. He'd stand there relaxed and still look flexed. Then he'd hit the pose and the audience would gasp. Literally gasp. Because the transformation was that extreme. The X-frame of his torso, with that impossibly small waist flaring up the shoulders and lats that seemed to belong to a man twice his weight, rewrote what judges thought possible. In 1968, he won again. Uncontested. Nobody even showed up to challenge him. Think about that. The best bodybuilders in the world looked at Sergio Oliva and decided it wasn't worth entering. They saw the photos. They heard the stories. And they knew. In 1969, he won a third time, beating a young Austrian newcomer named Arnold Schwarzenegger. Arnold had come to America with big dreams and bigger confidence. He'd won Mr. Universe. He'd turned heads in Europe. But standing next to Sergio, he looked narrow, looked mortal. And that's when the real story begins. Because Arnold wasn't used to losing, and the bodybuilding establishment wasn't used to someone they couldn't control. Mid-1969, Arnold comes to Chicago. Word spreads that he wants to train with Sergio at the Duncan YMCA. It's not a publicity stunt. There are no cameras, no reporters, just two future legends meeting in a basement gym on a summer afternoon when the heat makes the chalk stick to your hands. Training partners who were there describe it in hushed tones, like they'd witnessed something sacred. Heavy lifting, friendly rivalry. Arnold pushing himself harder than usual, trying to match Sergio's intensity. Sergio showing volume and endurance that made Arnold, who trained with intensity that scared most men, look almost human by comparison. They traded sets on bench press. Sergio would do his rest pause sets, hitting 25 reps with 3 plates, and Arnold would follow with his own version, grinding through 12 before his spotter had to help. They moved the squats. Sergio loaded 500 and repped it for 15. Arnold matched the weight, but stopped at 10. Not because he couldn't do more, because watching Sergio made more feel infinite. The details are scarce because this was before every gym moment got filmed, before every workout became content. This was private, sacred. 2 men testing themselves against each other in the way warriors have always tested themselves. Quietly, seriously, with respect earned through action rather than words. And in that basement, surrounded by the smell of old sweat and rust, they traded sets while the rest of the gym watched in silence. Men who'd been training for decades stood with their own barbells forgotten, just watching. Because they knew they were seeing something that would become legend. The Austrian and the Cuban, the future and the present, the poster boy and the myth. The 1970 Olympia went to Arnold. Many believed Sergio should have won. The debate started immediately after the decision was announced. Sergio supporters pointed to his smaller waist, his fuller muscle bellies, his superior conditioning in the back and legs. Arnold supporters pointed to his chest, his arms, his charisma. But underneath the debate was something nobody wanted to say out loud. Arnold was marketable, spoke perfect English, smiled for cameras, gave interviews that sounded like movie scripts. Sergio did interviews in broken English, and sometimes seemed annoyed by the question. The Weeders wanted a champion who'd cooperate, who'd sell magazines, who'd follow the program. In 1971, Sergio was barred from competing because he'd entered a rival federation show. Politics, control, the IFBB flexing its power to remind athletes who was in charge. Arnold won unopposed. No competition. No controversy, just Arnold on stage alone, accepting a title that felt hollow even to some of his fans. Then came 1972. Essen, Germany. Sergio returns to challenge Arnold one last time. He's been training with fury, treating every workout like revenge. Backstage before prejudging, he's hitting poses and saying things like, "Hey baby, Look at this shot, trying to get in Arnold's head, flexing his arms next to Arnold, hitting a side chest and making Arnold's look flat by comparison. The psychological warfare that Arnold would become famous for, Sergio wrote that playbook. On stage, he brings that same impossible physique, maybe even better than 69. Harder, fuller, more dangerous. And again, the decision goes to Arnold. The controversy still echoes. Many historians, even some who love Arnold, admit that Sergio might have deserved that title. But here's what nobody says loud enough. Sergio's independence cost him. He trained how he wanted, ate how he wanted, didn't play nice with officials or photographers or the politics that decided who got magazine covers and supplement contracts. The IFBB wanted a champion they could control, someone camera-friendly, someone who'd smile and say the right things. Sergio was a Cuban defector who spoke broken English and did things his own way. His physique frightened them. His refusal to bow frightened them more. So they gave the crown to someone who knew how to wear it properly. But life has a way of humbling even myths. In 1976, Sergio became a Chicago police officer. They had to custom make his uniforms because his arms wouldn't fit standard sleeves. His chest strained the buttons. His thighs stretched the fabric tight. He patrolled neighborhoods like Rogers Park, and residents would see him and think they were looking at a superhero in blue. Kids would ask for autographs. Adults would shake his hand and feel those fingers, thick as rope, close around theirs. For years, he balanced cop work with occasional guest posing with seminars, with being a living legend who still loved to dance on Saturday nights to Latin music that reminded him of home. Salsa, merengue, rhythms that took him back to beaches in Havana before the world got complicated. Then, in 1986, during a domestic dispute, his then-wife Arlene shot him 5 times in the abdomen with his own service revolver. 5 bullets. Point-blank range. The man who'd survived Castro's Cuba, a steel foundry, and the politics of bodybuilding almost died in his own home. He survived. But competitive bodybuilding was over. The marriage was over. The body that had seemed indestructible was finally breakable. Surgeries, recovery, physical therapy, learning to move again without pain tearing through his core. And yet, he kept working as a cop until 2003, kept showing up, kept living, because the same stubbornness that made him train after 12-hour shifts made him refuse to quit when bullets tried to stop him. He died on November 12, 2012, from kidney-related complications. The bodybuilding world mourned. The myth was gone, but his legacy refused to die with him. His son, Sergio Oliva Jr., became an IFBB pro, winning the 2015 NPC Nationals overall, carrying his father's name on the stages his father once dominated. And fans still argue, still debate, still pull up those old photos from 67 and 68 and ask the same question. Has anyone ever looked better? Some say Ronnie. Some say Arnold. Some say Dorian. But there's a group growing every year that says Sergio's prime physique remains untouched, not just for size, for shape, for that quality that made you look twice and still not believe your eyes. There's an anime character named Biscuit Oliva in a series called Baki the Grappler. He's built like a god, moves like a fighter, and radiates invincibility. He's based on Sergio, because that's what Sergio became. Not just a man, a myth that escaped into culture and refused to fade. The only Hispanic Mr. Olympia in history. A champion who won despite a system that wanted him to lose. A Cuban defector who traded sugar fields for steel foundries and still found the energy to build something judges didn't have words for. And here's the final secret, the one that ties everything together. Those workouts weren't written down. There was no program you could buy, no seminar that revealed the magic formula. People asked him all the time, journalists, training partners, younger bodybuilders looking for shortcuts. And Sergio would shrug and give vague answers. High reps, lots of sets, feel the muscle, chase the pump. But that wasn't really an answer, because the formula wasn't in the sets and reps. It was in the life that shaped them. A childhood where hard work meant survival. An adolescence spent lifting crude iron on beaches where nobody cared about symmetry, just strength. A defection that taught him risk and reward. A factory job that taught him what real exhaustion felt like, and how to push past it anyway. High volume because he'd spent years doing high volume labor. Constant tension because tension was all he'd ever known. Rest pause because light had taught him you rest just enough to keep going, never enough to quit. The pump obsession because feeling his muscles swell reminded him he was alive, free, building something nobody could take away. Those partial reps came from intuition built in thousands of hours under weight, learning where his muscles worked and where they rested. The high rep sets came from sugarcane fields where one more swing always meant one more dollar for the family. The relentless training after brutal work shifts came from a man who'd risked his life for freedom and wasn't about to waste his sleeping. Sergio Oliva's body wasn't built by a secret Cuban workout. It was built by a secret Cuban life. And when that life met iron in a Chicago basement, something happened that the judges, the officials, the politics, and even time itself couldn't quite kill. They called him the myth because nobody thought a physique like that could be real. 50 years later, people still look at those photos and feel the same disbelief. Maybe that's the real secret. Not the reps or the sets, but the refusal to be anything less than impossible. Next time, we'll talk about the other man they said couldn't be real. The king who trained in a dungeon and made Arnold look small. But that's another story for another night.